Dedicate this year and really this entire semester is sponsored in the memory of Mel and Sylvia David by their families. It's Menachem Mendel ben Avraham Meir Betoiva Rivka, Tzivia Chaya Bat Ariel Vechava Idel, שיהיה לעילוי נשמה. Okay, so because of the times of upcoming Chagim, it's coming. Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, it's not Pesach, so people don't get too excited. It's only a day of judgment and day of forgiveness. It's not a big deal, right? So I thought that we should discuss one of the major commandments, which is Vidui, confession. So we'll talk about some of the halachot. Through the halachot, we'll obviously discover the hashkafa. And then hopefully we will get insight into one of the most important things or mitzvot that we need to do during Aseret Yemei Teshuvah and also during the year too. So the Gemara says the following. Gemara in your mind, Daf Pei Zayin Amud Bet. Tanu Rabbanan. Mitzvat Vidui. Erev Yom HaKippurim Im Chashecha. By the way, today we will deal more with the halachot and how it developed. Okay? So Tanu Rabbanan. Mitzvat Vidui. Erev Yom HaKippurim Im Chashecha. So the mitzvah of confession begins when? Erev Yom Kippur Im Chashecha. So when is that exactly? The what? Ba'erev. So that's Tfilat Ma'ariv. That's the Kol Nidre and then Ma'ariv. This is Mincha. This is when what does mean Im Chashecha? Okay, so let's just leave it like that because we will see, obviously, a dispute. אבל אמרו חכמים, יתוודה קודם שיאכל וישתה, שמא תתערב דעתו בסעודה. ואף על פי שיתוודה קודם שאכל ושתה, מתוודה לאחר שיאכל וישתה. שמא אירע דבר כלכלה בסעודה. Okay, so the first halacha says what? One vidui, one confession. When? Im Chashecha. Erev Yom Kippur Im Chashecha. However, when Chachamim saw it, I don't know, a week later, 3 years later, I don't know, they claimed, no, you should confess before you eat and drink, which means before Seudah Mafseket, right? Why? Shema titaref da'ato b'seudah. Maybe your mind will be, you will get a little crazy in the Seudah. ואף על פי שהתוודה קודם שאכל ושתה, and even though you confessed before you ate, you need to do what? Another one. Now, רגע, and why? שמא אירע דבר כלכלה בסעודה, because maybe you committed some kind of a sin, okay, during the סעודה, you didn't bench properly, so therefore do another vidui. But the second vidui, is that part of what we spoke about im chashecha, or that's another one? Which means one before the meal, one after the meal, and one mishechashecha. Okay, don't answer yet because be careful. There is a debate here, so you don't want to align yourself yet with someone that maybe the halacha is not like him, right? So wait. ואף על פי שהתוודה ערבית, so even though you confess during nighttime, יתוודה שחרית, you will do it in the morning time. שחרית יתוודה במוסף, so שחרית, you also will have a confession where מוסף time. במוסף יתוודה במנחה, you also have מנחה time. במנחה יתוודה בנעילה. Also you need to do it נעילה, so 5 times. So in Yom Kippur itself you have 5 times. So we have ערבית, שחרית, מוסף, מנחה, נעילה, רגע, that's wonderful. But what about the other 2? One before the meal and one after the meal, that it might be a new entity or part of Ma'ariv. והיכן אומרו, where do you place the vidui? Where do you say the confession? יחיד אחר תפילתו. So an individual says it after you finish davening, basically. ושליח ציבור אומרו באמצע. That's exactly what we do, right? ממש exactly what we do. As individuals, we recite תחנון, we recite vidui at the end of davening for us, and the shaliach ציבור says it in the middle of 18. Says Rashi, אם חשיכה לאחר אכילה משקיבל עליו יום כיפור. So you basically eat סעודה מפסקת and you finish it 1 minute before, 5 minutes before Yom Kippur begins. And then after you accepted upon yourself Yom Kippur, which is when, technically, חשיכה, right? I know what you're thinking, but that's not what Rashi says. He is not talking about what? Tfilah zakah. He is talking about what? When you daven Ma'ariv, that's the time for what? For Vidui. However, the Ramban, so Rashi was 11th century in France, so Ramban is 13th century in Spain, and then moved here. הדתנו רבנן, מצוות וידוי ערב יום הכיפורים עם חשיכה. אבל אמרו חכמים, יתוודה קודם שיאכל וישתה, שמא תתערב דעתו בסעודה, ואף על פי שיתוודה קודם שיאכל וישתה, מתוודה לאחר שיאכל וישתה. So he quoted what we read before, okay? So no חידושים, nothing new here. Now, נראה לפי דקדוק הלשון הזה, it seems to be based, if you are really meticulous with the sentences themselves, שאין הוידוי שהוא מתוודה לאחר התפילה, לאחר אכילה, בתפילת ערבית. It says, the vidui that we are talking about, it's not the vidui that you say when? During Ma'ariv. It's a different vidui. מדלא קטני, ואף על פי שהתוודה קודם שיאכל וישתה, מתוודה ערבית, וכדקטני, אף על פי שהתוודה ערבית. So, first proof is what? It says, אף על פי שהתוודה קודם שיאכל וישתה, that he should what? Make confession before he eats and drink, he still need to do another one after he ate and he drank. And then it says, also you need to confess when? Ma'ariv. Meaning, if it was identical, the language should have been what? אף על פי שהתוודה, even though he confessed when? Before he ate and drank. Before he eats and drink, he needs to what? To create a confession, to make a confession when? בתפילת ערבית. So from the fact that he does not say it like that, it means what? You are talking about another confession. ועוד, and he brings another proof, הקטני, דמצוות וידוי ערב יום הכיפורים הוא עם חשיכה, when it says that a commandment to confess ערב יום כיפור it's עם חשיכה, when it's become dark, היינו לאחר שיאכל וישתה, it's after he ate and drank, אלא שהקדימו לו חכמים להתוודות, קודם שיאכל משום שמא תתערף דעתו בסעודה. But חכמים decided, you know what? Let's add another confession before the meal, because maybe in the meal things can go wrong. ועלה כאמר, שאף על פי שהצריכו לו להקדים ולהתוודות, עיקר הוידוי לא הפסיד את מקומו, וצריך להתוודות לאחר שאכל ושתה דהיינו עם חשיכה. Says the Ramban, that when we speak about that you need to make a confession after, meaning עם חשיכה, so when they establish the idea that you need to make a confession before you eat and drink, and then after you eat and drink, it does not mean to come to omit the confession that you need to do im chashecha and to align it with what? With the evening confession, but rather one before the meal, one after the meal, and then one arvit, shachrit, musaf, mincha, neila. So really, how many times do you need to confess according to that? 7 times.
Doesn't make any sense.
Why?
That's before and after the meal.
If what?
Why did he do 3 times error? Why not just
2. Twice. Oh, okay, very good. Why? Now, by the way, you see, the Ramban goes out of its way to try to prove it. Right? We didn't see it in Rashi, obviously. The Ramban goes out of its way to bring proofs that there is another vidui before Yom Kippur. Now, obviously there are some halachic ramifications, but even more than the halachic ramifications, it seems to be that there is something hashkafic there. Right? It seems to be that according to the Ramban, this vidui before you enter Yom Kippur has some kind of a special quality. Let's continue. ואילו ערבית לא מקרי לאחר שאכל ושתה, דלאו סמוך לאכילהו. בתפילת ערבית, שמע עלה. He says, if the Talmud wants to say that you need to confess during Ma'ariv or Arvit, then the Gemara knows how to say that. So from the fact that the Gemara says, im chashecha, it means, ולא בתפילת ערבית. This is not the same one. ועוד, מאי אף על פי, וכי תעלה על דעתך שלא יתוודה ביום הכיפורים עצמו, ואין וידוי ערבית, אלא משום שמא אירע דבר כלכלה של עבירה בסעודה, וענן מצוות וידוי של ערב יום הכיפורים כאמרינן, דהוא עם חשיכה, אבל של יום הכיפורים ודאי בעיצומו של יום הוא. So now the final proof is what? It says, we are talking about what? תנו רבנן, מצוות וידוי, ערב יום הכיפורים, מי שעם חשיכה, which means we speak about two things. Part A, the confessions that you do ערב יום כיפור. Part B, all the confessions that you have when? ביום כיפור עצמו. Two different things. Don't mix them. That's what the Ramban says. So we're not going to have a test on all his proofs, but he basically says that there is another vidui prior to Yom Kippur itself. He says, Ela mashma, now it's bolded, Ela mashma dehachiktani. מצוות וידוי של ערב יום הכיפורים שצריך להתוודות כדי שייכנס ליום בתשובה הוא עם חשיכה סמוך ליום עצמו. Told you, it's not only halacha, it's also השקפה. I want you to enter Yom Kippur עם וידוי, with a confession. And why do I want to do it so close to what? To כל נדרי? Answer, שלא יהא שעות לחטוא בין הווידוי והיום. So you don't have much time to what? To sin. Believe me, we are very quick. Yeah, right, we can do it very quickly. But think about it. You come, you say tefillah zakah, you do confession, really tefillah zakah is somewhat of a confession, and then immediately they start kol nidrei. So you can always find time to sin, but it's really try to what? To bring it as close as you can. אבל חששו חכמים, שמא תתערב דעתו בסעודה, וימנע בשכרותו מן הווידוי. Now this is very interesting, by the way. Who drinks wine in Sudan Mufseket? Not even the wine snobs. Okay, I don't know anyone who drinks wine in Sudan. Does not mean does not exist, but I don't really think that people drink wine during Sudan Mufseket. So, but in his time, people drank wine, okay? Water was not exactly their beverage of choice. The what?
It was contaminated. It wasn't safe.
Right. And water was for animals, right? Wine for us. So he says, the what?
Say in the mincha you say the vidui, and then he's calling the tefillah zakah vidui.
He doesn't call it tefillah zakah yet. I called it tefillah zakah.
That's what he's calling.
I'm calling it tefillah zakah. He called it vidui. We will get there. Yeah. So then he says, ואף על פי שהתוודה קודם אכילה, so even though he confessed before the meal, חוזר ומתוודה בזמנו, so he needs to repeat the confession, בזמנו עם חשיכה, סמוך ליום עצמו, ממש close to יום כיפור. שמא אירע דבר כלכלה של עבירה בסעודה. ווידוי של ערבית, שהוא וידוי של יום הכיפורים עצמו, לא קטני, דוודאי מתוודאו ביום הכיפורים. So he makes this confession before he enters Yom Kippur, and the vidui on Ma'ariv, the confession that you do during Ma'ariv time, it's obvious that's part of what? Of Yom Kippur. אלא קטני, אף על פי שהתוודה ערבית, מתוודה שחרית, כל היום שמא אירע לו דבר עבירה כל היום, דיום הכיפורים עם חשיכה ומכפר, זוהי שיטת הברייתא הזו על נכון. So basically he says, you start the confessions of Yom Kippur itself on Erev Yom Kippur, which is the ערבית, ערבית, שחרית, מוסף, מנחה, נעילה, and in order to come into Yom Kippur, kadosh v'tahor, and we're trying to limit the time that you can commit sins, we will do one more time, mamash, before you go into Yom Kippur. Okay. The Ramban continues. This is a long Ramban. ומה שמסייעני עוד סיוע ברור, שמצאתי בתוספתא. Oh. Now, you understand, just in terms of the methodologia. You know what is methodologia? Okay, methodology. Okay. The Ramban does two things. It's very interesting. Most of the scholars in the Middle Ages will do that. When they create something new that was not there before, and it's a new interpretation, because until now, really, like for example, Rashi, in the 11th century in France, he basically says what? The confession after the meal, it's identical to what? To the confession that you do during Ma'ariv. There is no an additional one. Ramban comes along and says, Everyone who explained the Gemara like that is what? Is not correct. Okay? You misunderstood it. There is another confession. So he proved it what? From being meticulous in the language itself and from some textual proofs. Now, that's wonderful, but we can all argue. Says Ramban, I found another Tanaic source that aligned with my opinion, the Tosefta. Tosefta is like the Mishnah in terms of the status. It's a Tanaic source, but it was composed, some people say before the Mishnah, some people say at the time of the Mishnah, and some people say a little bit after the Mishnah. Okay? And in a way, they are all right. It depends. There are some Toseftaot that Tashma and many others proved that was what we call Tosefta Kduma. It was an ancient Tanaic source which was probably even before the Mishnah, and the Mishnah in a way derived its laws from it. Some of it was at the same time of the Mishnah, and some of it was a little bit later, because we know that in the Tosefta we have one of the Amoraim, Rav. Rav Tana Ufalik. Rav was on the last generation of Tanaim, first generation Amoraim. So he is not in the Mishnah anywhere, but he is in the Tosefta. And sometimes you can see that the Tosefta in a way took the Mishnah and expanded on it. So obviously, it depends on the Tosefta. You need to really learn every Tosefta and every Masechet in a different way. Okay, בסדר. So he says, ומה שמסייעני עוד סיוע ברור, שמצאתי בתוספתא תקטני, so he found in the Tosefta that it says there the following, מצוות וידוי ערב יום הכיפורים עם חשיכה, אבל אמרו חכמים, מתוודה אדם קודם שיאכל וישתה, שמא תתערב דעתו בתוך אכילה ושתייה, ואף על פי שיתוודה קודם שיאכל וישתה, צריך שיתוודה לאחר אכילה ושתייה, שמא ירא דבר כלכלה בסעודה, ואף על פי שיתוודה לאחר שאכל ושתה, צריך שיתוודה ערבית. ואף על פי שיתוודה ערבית, צריך להתוודה שחרית. ואף על פי שיתוודה בשחרית, צריך שיתוודה בנעילה, שמא אירע דבר כלכלה כל היום. So what's the proof? Here it says it perfectly clear. Before the meal, after the meal. מעריב, שחרית, מוסף, מנחה, נעילה. So obviously there is another confession which is after the meal, which is not תפילת ערבית. He says, הרי זה מפורש. אלא שבעלי הגמרא לא שנו בברייתא שהביאו בגמרא, אף על פי, מוידוי של ערב יום הכיפורים לוידוי של ערבית, מן הטעם שפירשנו. ובתוספתא שנו אותו בפירוש לומר, שאף על פי שהתוודה וידוי יותר סמוך ליום הכיפורים, לא פתר את של ערבית. אבל כולם לדבר אחד נתכוונו, שמתוודה קודם אכילה, ומתוודה אחר אכילה, סמוך לחשיכה, ומתוודה ערבית וכל היום. So he says, here is my proof. גמרנו. Don't argue with me. There is one before the meal, one after the meal, close to what to Yom Kippur, and then ערבית, שחרית, מוסף, מנחה, נעילה. ורש"י ז"ל, I'm well aware, says the Rambam, that Rashi מפרש עם חשיכה ערבית משקידש היום. It's really מעריב. He identifies the confession after the meal with ערבית. He says, ואינו כן בשום מקום. Sorry Rashi, but I have no idea where you got that from. וכן הראשונים כולם לא כתבו זה בחיבוריהם שהתוודה 2 פעמים בערב יום הכיפורים, ולא דקדקו בברייתא הזו. ומה שכתבנו האמת והנכון והישר. He says, Rashi says that there is only one confession on ערב יום כיפור, which is what? מנחה time. And then we start with ערבית. And he says, and all the other ראשונים agree with Rashi. But what I wrote הוא האמת, הנכון והישר. Now, first the courage, not chutzpah, courage, omets. He has his own interpretation of the Gemara. He has proofs. He doesn't say, oh, I feel like they are wrong, or I think, no. He showed from the text itself, A, B, he found Tosefta. So he says, they might not know about the Tosefta, or maybe they misunderstood it. I'm telling you, what I'm telling you is Nachon, Emet, Ve'yashar. And then it says, Ve'elokei, Emet, Rav Chesed, Ve'emet, so he's obviously inspired by the Slichot, באמת ובחסד וברחמים וימחול לעוונותינו ולפשעינו, אמן, וכן יהי רצון. Everyone can say amen, that's wonderful, but that's what the Ramban says. So the Ramban goes against all the Rishonim, and he says from now on, you need to have another confession before you enter Yom Kippur. What about the Rambam? So, yeah.
Why mincha?
זה לפני האוכל. Before סעודה מפסקת. Most people daven mincha early. Yeah.
I was thinking about the concept of the 9th of Tishrei being somehow connected with the 10th, in the sense that Misha Tzam Erev Yom Kippur Alei Alav HaKatov Kilu Tzam Shiva Asiri. So that there's some sort
כל האוכל בתשיעי. כל האוכל, not some.
yeah, they're connected to Vidui with the Achilah. So it's somehow there's some sort of kedusha that's connected with the Ochel on Erev Yom Kippur, which is related to that.
Yeah, it maybe a סממן של יום טוב, not necessarily with the confession. Okay, but maybe. Says the Rambam, Maimonides now, obviously in halachic authority, 12th century, says the following. יום הכיפורים הוא זמן תשובה לכל, ליחיד, לרבים. So it's a time for תשובה for everyone, for the individual, for the public, for the community. והוא קץ מחילה וסליחה לישראל. And it's a time for what? For atonement and forgiveness to עם ישראל. לפיכך, therefore, חייבים הכל לעשות תשובה ולהתוודות ביום הכיפורים. Everyone must do what? תשובה and to confess on Yom Kippur. Okay, I'm not going to deal with the first and a half sentence because that itself can be a different shiur. Okay, especially when the Rambam himself in Hilchot Tshuva in Perek Aleph, Halacha Aleph says, כשיעשה תשובה, חייב להתוודות, which means the mitzvah is confession, חייב להתוודות, but when he talks about תשובה, he says, כשיעשה, when he will do. Okay, what does it mean? Okay, but so we're not dealing with that. I'm more interested in the confessions. So, ומצוות וידוי יום הכיפורים. So, now he's going to define the mitzvah of vidui, of confession on Yom Kippur. שיתחיל מערב היום קודם שיאכל, שמא יחנק בסעודה קודם שיתוודה. So, one confession is before the meal, because what? We are afraid that you will choke and you will die without confession. So it's not about שמא ישתכר. Okay, it's not about what? That he will get drunk. This is about getting choked. Okay, so you don't want to choke to death without making a confession before. Okay. ואף על פי שהתוודה קודם שיאכל, חוזר ומתוודה בלילי יום הכיפורים ערבית. וחוזר ומתוודה שחרית, מוסף, מנחה, נעילה. והיכן מתוודה, יחיד אחר תפילתו, שליח ציבור באמצע תפילתו בברכה רביעית. What can you learn from the Rambam? The what? יפה מאוד. The Rambam. Once. The Rambam says exactly like all the other Rishonim. Now why did I bring that Rambam? Because the Ramban knew the Rambam. How do I know that? First, 12th century versus 13th century. A. B. The writings of the Rambam already infiltrated into Spain. C. The Ramban himself wrote commentary on the Rambam. So we definitely know that he saw him, and he saw. And even though the Rambam is a tremendous halachic authority, the Ramban a century later basically says he was also wrong.
Maybe he doesn't take them on. He only takes on Rashi. In the Torah factor, he doesn't take on the Rambam.
Because the Rambam did not write an interpretation on the Gemara in that sense. He basically, what he claims, the Ramban, says that the first one to originate that mistake is Rashi. And the Rambam, now, I'm not sure the Rambam saw Rashi, by the way. That's probably the answer will be not, that he didn't see Rashi. Now you will ask me, how did he learn Gemara without Rashi? You can ask Rashi, how did he learn Gemara without Rashi? Okay, so you can learn Gemara without Rashi, a little bit complicated. The what? The what? Rashi was Rashi, yeah. Okay, so that's what the Rambam says. Shulchan Aruch, so now we move to the 16th century, Tzfat. Rabbi Yosef Karo, Shulchan Aruch, הלכות יום הכיפורים, תרז סעיף א', צריך להתוודות במנחה קודם סעודה מפסקת. So you need to what? To confess מנחתיים, before סעודה מפסקת, says the רמה, הגה, ויחיד אומרו אחר שגמר תפילתו, ושץ אומרו ביום כיפורים בתוך התפילה. So the individual says it in, at the end of his davening, and Shat says it in the middle of his davening. Says the Mishnah ברורה. מה? אומרו ביום כיפור בתוך התפילה. כן, מנחה, the שליח ציבור does not repeat the וידוי. משנה ברורה, קודם סעודה מפסקת, שמא יארע לו דבר כלכלה בסעודה שיחנק או שתתערף דעתו ולא יוכל להתוודות אחר כך. אוקיי, now take a look at the משנה ברורה. ויש פוסקים שסוברים, there are some פוסקים, halachic decisors, that they claim שצריך להתוודות גם אחר אכילה קודם חשיכה, that there is a mitzvah to confess again after the meal before יום כיפור, וראוי להחמיר כדעה זו. And it's worthy, or it's worthwhile, or it's advisable to what? To take this stringency on you, and then, וכן נהגו בזמננו. So by the way, he quotes the שלה. Okay, שני לוחות הברית. It's more of a little bit of a mystical work, that you need to accept the Ramban, וכן נהגו בזמננו, שאומרים אז תפילה זכה. By the way, do you know the ספרדים do not say תפילה זכה?
Why not?
They wake up for sliches all חודש, do you think they need to do it again? By the way, I'll tell you another thing. The ספרדים also, most of them do not have היום הרת עולה. They don't have ונתן לתוקף. They don't have ונתן לתוקף? They don't have ונתן לתוקף. And they continue to celebrate Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and get excited. Okay? So, basically the Mishnah Berurah, and we see some kind of an halachic evolution. It's very interesting. That's why I also mentioned to you the years. Rashi, 11th century, set up the bar. Basically, we don't have another vidui after food, after the meal. You go to Arvit. For 2 centuries at least, it was like that. Ramban comes along and says that's not true. It's wrong. I have proofs, okay? Even though the Ramban says what he says, and he says, זה אמת, נכון וישר. People said, what? Forget it. The Shulchan Aruch, 16th century, pasking like the Rambam. Sure, he's not going to consider the Ramban. I mean, he considered him, but he rejected him. The Mishnah Berurah comes along, and he brings the Shla, and he says 2 things. At the time of the Shla, they said that it's a chumrah that you should accept, and in the beginning of the 20th century, okay, it's become what? A tefillah zakah, that how many of you miss it? Oh wow, ooh. I thought that would be that, like, well, we do everything we can in order not to miss it. There's never enough time, right? The timing with the Suda Mafseket, it's just like in the middle of the Suda Mafseket. But the idea is that we all try to say it, right? We all try to say it. We all understand that it's not halacha, but we all try to say it. Now, this is, by itself, can be a, yes? I'm not surprised. Not surprised. By the way, many men read it and they don't understand what are they talking about, right? They didn't do any of the sins that are mentioned there, right? So as a woman, I understand you, fully understand you. By the way, there's also Vidui shel Haran, a Vidui Agadol shel Haran, Rabbeinu Nissim, also very men, meaning more about halachot and limud Torah and things like that. Can't say anything about it. I didn't write it. Yeah. So now it might be that, look, what the Ramban talked about, he did not talk about תפילה זכה. He spoke about ממש confession על חטא, כמו שעושים בערבית, שחרית, מוסף, מנחה נעילה. We deviated from it in a way. Why? Because on one hand, we didn't want to paskin like the Ramban against everyone else. On the other hand, it's really nice to do another one, before you go into Yom Kippur. And really, when you go through it, as a man, okay, you basically, and even a little bit even for a woman, you go really through all the limbs and the parts and of the body parts and your thoughts and everything, and you say, I did all those things, and how can I can't believe that I did something like that. God, you gave me wisdom, why did I do that? And then you try to do tshuva, there is something there which is very moving, betfilah zakah, but no one here will do al chet. So we need to find some kind of, try to find some kind of a compromise. Yes?
They start off saying it makes a difference to do it 4 times, 5 times, 7 times. Then he comes to Mishnah Brura, and lo mishaneh, you can add one. So I don't understand.
No, it's not to add more. No. Everyone agree.
It's okay if you know that.
No. Everyone agree there is one before you eat. And then Arvit, Shachrit, Musaf, Mincha, Neila. The only question is, do we have one more after the meal before you enter Yom Kippur? Ramban says yes. Halacha says no. Comes along the Mishnah Berurah and says, in the name of the Shla, we should accept it upon ourselves. In the time of the Shla, I don't know what they did. If they did a real confession or they already planned to compose this idea of Tfilah Zakah. He says, Bizmanenu, says the Mishnah Berurah, that's Zmanenu 21st century, 20th century. We called it Tfilah Zakah and that's what we do.
But how was the addition put in? How
What
did
do
they just, if there was
They,
such
they
a
didn't make it an obligation. Basically, they said, look, the Ramban's opinion is important enough for us to adopt. Now, we're not going to say confession because most of the Rishonim reject him. Therefore, let's just replace it with something. Meaning, we will keep the content or the purpose, but we're not going to want to keep the language. Okay. לא לכן וכן נהגו. There is a difference. לכן is therefore. וכן means what? And this is the minhag that we have, which means we continue the shla, and you can see, we're talking more about, I don't want to call it mysticism versus halacha, because the Ramban did not make the psak because of mysticism. He made the psak because of what? Let's quote unquote follow the money. The Ramban says what? He explained why he's so obsessed with another confession. He was obsessed with another confession. Why? Because he says he wants you to enter Yom Kippur with minimum time to commit sins and to come as pure as you can. That's it. Meaning, he basically says, and that's what the Tosefta wanted you to do. That's what the Braita wanted you to do. Rashi's explanation just deviated. Okay.
Who wrote Tfilah Zakah?
לא יודע. I will not even going to make it up. I guess we can Google it or ChatGPT it, and he might know, or she, or it, or they, or will, I don't know, what is the ChatGPT. So it's interesting. The Shla says that ראוי להחמיר כרמב"ן, which means to do a real confession. He says, וכן נהגו בזמננו, to hold like the Ramban, אבל אנחנו אומרים שאומרים אז תפילה זכה. Who composed it? לא יודע. I know there is one Vidui of Rabbi Nissim Gaon. It says Rabbi Nissim Gaon. But that's not תפילה זכה. So we can try to find out, but then it will be interesting because it will tell us a little bit about the time, for sure. It is what? It's very similar in content. Talking about, if אני עושה על חטא שחטאתי לפניך בהרהור הלב, על חטא שחטאתי לפניך בתשומת יד, it talks about all the parts of all the body parts. It's very similar. Very similar, yeah.
It's like that the composer of Tfilah Zakah was trying to split the difference between the Ramban and everybody else. Because he's saying you should do a confession, but he's not saying do the regular video.
Right, yeah, some kind of a compromise to keep the content but to change it from the regular video. Okay, 17th century Saloniki, Greece. Tosefet Yom HaKippurim, Masechet Yoma. That's an interpretation of the Gemara. Yes. Chaye Adam. So that's 20th century. So you got an answer. Yeah. So if it's true, and he did it, So you're talking about the 20th century. So now you understand that in the time of the Shla, they probably said the confession itself, ממש, כפשוטו, על חטא. And in the 20th century comes along the Chaye Adam, who was a contemporary of Mishnah Berurah, and he says, you know what, let's make it tefillah, and everyone loves it.
We have a boxer from before that time. I think we need to check that when we go home now.
You have a what?
We have a boxer from before that time.
Oh, okay, please. So next week, now you got yourself homework. So we need it for next week, Bezrat Hashem. That will be very interesting. Okay. So Rabbi Moshe Bar Rav Shlomo Ibn Chabiv, so 1654 Greece, so we're talking about 17th to 18th century. תנו רבנן. מצוות וידוי ערב יום הכיפורים עם חשרה פרש רש"י, לאחר אכילה, מי שקיבל עליו יום הכיפורים עד כאן. והדבר ברור, he says in it's clear, דרש"י בא לאפוקי, פירוש הרמב"ן שכתב הר"ן בשמו, ומרן הבית יוסף סימן תר"ז כתב, והעולם לא נהגו כהרמב"ן. So he says that what Rashi says obviously comes to exclude what the Ramban says. Now, not that Rashi came to exclude the Ramban, but in Rashi's interpretation, you can obviously understand that he does not hold like the Ramban. And then he says that the Bet Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Karo, in the 16th century, basically testified that what? That the Ramban was rejected. No one is following the Ramban. Omnam, פה ירושלים תיבנה ותיכונן במהרה בימינו, here in Jerusalem, so you understand that Rab Shlomo ben Chaviv made aliyah. נוהגים שקודם שהתפללו ערבית, the minhag is that before we daven Mariv, אומרים כל הקהל, ביקשתי לך אל תשוקתי, שיש בה וידוי לצאת ידי חובת הרמב"ן. He says, we here in Yerushalayim, which is minhag Sfaradim, we say, לך תשוקתי. And this is a pizmon or tefillah that was composed by the Sfaradim, which is what? Which is vidui. In order to fulfill the Ramban's opinion. וקשה לי לפירוש הרמב"ן, דפירש, צריך שיתוודה קודם שיקבל עליו יום כיפור, והוא וידוי שאינו סמוך לתפילה, איך אשכחן שיתוודה בלי תפילה, והלא כל הוידויים של יום הכיפורים הם סמוכים לתפילה. So he says, I have a question on the Ramban. The Ramban, original Ramban, I'm not talking about לך תשוקתי or תפילה זכה. Ramban says you need to do what? After you finish the meal, what do you need to do? Okay. Says Rab Moshe ben Chaviv, he says, how can you do that? We see that always confession comes with tefillah. The vidui that you do before the meal, you do it during mincha time, tefillat mincha. All the viduim have something to do with tefillah. How come that you finish Sudam of second and you start going to do al-chet? So that's his problem with the Ramban. Now he has a problem with Rashi as well. ולפירוש רש"י קשה לי, מה ישנה ואף על פי שהתוודה קודם שאכל ושתה מתוודה, ופירש רש"י כלכלה של חדל, למה ליח תמה, טיפוק לדצריך להתוודות בליל יום הכיפורים. דעיקר הווידוי ביום הכיפורים. So he says, I don't understand Rashi either. Rashi says, why do I need to make a confession after I ate? Because, and that's what vidui, tfilat ma'ariv. And why? Because something maybe happened during the meal. He says, that's nothing to do with it. Why do I need to make a confession, Arvit of Yom Kippur? Because that's when the day begins, right? And we have 5 viduim. Arvit, Shachrit, Musaf, Mincha, Neila. That has nothing to do with the meal. It seems to be like Rashi. Let's say in the meal, I didn't do anything. Klum. Shum chet. So I don't need to make the confession. So he says that's nothing to do with each other. You definitely will need to make a confession, Tfilat Arvit, even if you didn't do any chet. Why? Because that's the day. That's the essence of the day. So he says, וראיתי, דהריף והראש לא גרסי הכי. says the Rif and the Rosh had a different גרסה. What was their גרסה? אף על פי שהתוודה קודם שיאכל וישתה, even though he made a confession before he ate and he drank, צריך שיתוודה אחר שיאכל וישתה, ואף על פי שהתוודה ערבית, וזוהי גרסה נכונה, לפי רש"י וסייעתו ודוק. So he says the גרסה is what? That even though you confess before you ate, you need to confess after you ate, and even though you confessed Arvit, you need to confess Shachrit Mincha. That sounds a little bit like Ramban. Surprise, surprise, he says, וזוהי גרסה נכונה לפירוש רש"י וסיעתו. And that's a good גרסה for Rashi. This is not a good girsa for Rashi. This is a good girsa for the Ramban. That's exactly what the Ramban says in the name of the Tosefta. So I'll leave it the way it is. I'm not going to deal with the question on him. I just wanted to bring him in order to show you what the Sfaradim did in order to replace, quote unquote, the Ramban's opinion. A, and B, how, and this is something very interesting, how come that for בערך 4 centuries people ignored the Ramban, and surprise, surprise, around the 17th century, פתאום, the Ramban. It's an interesting thing.
It's also interesting that Sfardim would go after the Ashkenazi Ramban rather than Sfardi Rambam.
Okay. So what they did is that they didn't replace it. They just created some kind of a replica that it's not Mamash Ramban. Okay? I know you're not historians, or maybe there are a few historians here. But what can we learn from it about, I will call it, the evolution of Yom Kippur in the eyes of the public? Is my question clear? Yes, no. Meaning, the Ramban says, 13th century, he says, look, guys, we need to come to Yom Kippur pure. We need to minimize the time for people to talk too much Lashon Hara. Let's say there is another confession before you go to Shul, and you do it. Because we want to bring you to Yom Kippur as pure as I can, as close as I can, minimize time, and move on to Kol Nidre and Mariv. That's what he said in the 13th century. For 4 centuries, he was rejected. People didn't pay any attention to him. Pitom, in Israel, 17th century, Pitom, the Sfardim comes along, later on the Ashkenazim comes along. What can we learn about the attitude or the approach towards Yom Kippur? Awesome.
Was that the only thing that was ignored of his?
Oh, no, many things that he said were ignored, but here,
I mean, it's like, I'm thinking in another term, that Bach's music was forgotten in a closet, misplaced, and it was Mendelssohn who brought it out, and it was like, oh my God, it's Bach. It was just a choice to ignore this part?
No, at the beginning, it was a discussion in Talmudic interpretation. Ramban claimed that all the Talmudists were wrong in their interpretation. His interpretation is emet, nachon, v'yashar. Most of the Rishonim says to the Ramban, we don't think so. Okay? Then, in Halacha, because you look at Halacha, you look at the framework of Halacha. Most Rishonim are against him, so we're going to reject him. Then Pitom is being renewed. He's being resurrected. Yes?
I think it has to do with the expulsion from Spain and Portugal, the movement to east, and a way of one of the many ways of coping with the Inquisition and the expulsion.
So that will be more 15th century. So we need to see with the Sfaradim, the 1492 was the expulsion, right?
Was the end of the 15th century.
Right.
But you don't see the impact until many decades later.
Okay. There is something interesting that when we talk about, and I think we'll do, next week we'll start the next topic. But even in the halacha itself, pure halacha, you see that the movement towards Yom Kippur, in terms of that it's becoming the holiest day, which by the way, it's not true. What is the holiest day on the Jewish calendar? Shabbat. It comes every week. Not Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is called Shabbat Shabbaton. Okay? little mini Shabbat. We have the opportunity to reach the most holy day on when? Every week. Okay? However, but Yom Kippur became the holiest day. Jews who are not necessarily observant, you will find them in shul on Yom Kippur. You're not going necessarily to find them on Shabbat. So, when you understand a bit history of halacha, you can see that sometimes because of a need to make Yom Kippur more relevant and to, I would say, to strengthen it with more and more elements of tefillah, of vidui, of all sorts of things like that, it becomes what? You start bringing opinions that were forgotten, but basically you add the content that you want for Yom Kippur. What do I mean by that? Here, it's a brilliant way. The halacha does not say that now the halacha is like the Ramban and you need to have 7 times confession. Before the meal, after the meal, arvit, shachrit, musaf, mincha, ne'ilah. No. We still have the halachic framework of what? 1 before the meal, arvit, shachrit, musaf, mincha, ne'ilah. However, mamash few minutes before Yom Kippur enter, I need to get you a Jew to the mood. I need to get you to what? To this climate, to this environment of Yom Kippur. I don't want you to come to Erev Yom Kippur like you come on a Friday evening. You know, wet hair, trying to find your shirt, coming from a tiyul. No. I want you to come עם הראש ביום כיפור. And therefore, I'm going to create confession. Now, I can't go and call it confession because that's against all the Rishonim. Besides the Ramban. What I'm going to do, I'm going to create a replacement. I'm going to call it Tfilah Zakah, I'm going to call it Lechat Shukati, whatever it is, but I will bring the content of the Vidui, and to some extent, I will tell you, at least for men, the Tfilah Zakah is much more understandable than the Al-Chet. Because I can give you a test here, and I'll give you some Al-Chet, and it will be interesting to see what's your interpretation. Okay, without the English Machzor that tells you what it is, and a list of things that you did or you didn't do. It's much more complicated. The Tfilah Zakah is mamash very detailed and very clear. So, to sum up what we did today, we saw different interpretations of the Talmudic paragraph. We saw the very courageous stand of the Ramban. We saw that he was rejected, but then was resurrected to some extent. And the resurrection, we suggested, had something to do with the need, call it the need, in later centuries. It might be because of a traumatic calamity and event such as the Spanish expulsion and other things. And it came to what we know now, or really started with the Sfaradim in the 17th century with Lechat Shukati, or the 20th century Tfilah Zakah that we know today. Okay, one request, please. Keep it. If you want it for next week, highly recommend it. Take it home, bring it, keep it, because it will not be here next week.